we are joined by Mr. Samir Abbass. He is an Egyptologist and a historian. Good morning.
Good morning, Shireen.
A very good morning to you, Mr. Samir. Obviously, as Shireen just mentioned, Egypt has declared Aswan as the capital of African youth, but also Africa's cultural capital. So can you tell us a little bit more, because the history of Aswan and Africa, it has always been the gateway, if we will, of Egypt to Africa.
Tell us a little bit more about that. That's completely right. So that was, first of all, that was a good choice, especially for Aswan, because Aswan in Egypt history, in ancient history, is always used to be the gateway of Africa. And what I'm thinking actually, which is the best approach of our subject today, is to show how Aswan played a great role in ancient Egyptian history, and to introduce as a gateway to Africa, and what is the lessons which is we can learn from this successful relationship between Egypt and Africa back in the ancient time, and how we can implement that in our modern history today. So first of all, we need to understand that Egypt is part of Africa, and that is a very important part in our talk today. And for the ancient Egyptians, that was something which they were very proud of. And so when you look at the ancient Egyptian art and the ancient Egyptian culture, it is very clear that they had a very strong root with Africa in that time. Even when we introduce the roots of the ancient Egyptian civilization, it started from the south, and it was spreading with the Nile River, with the Nile flows to the north. Right. And some of the very important historical sites or prehistorical sites in Egypt actually lies in the south, is Nabta Playa. That's where the Stonehenge, which is a very famous one, which is considered a very advanced astronomical tools for predicting the rain season, the cultivation, the harvest season. So in the ancient Egyptians, they looked at in Africa as a very good place for trading with, and for securing their needs from raw material and from the water as well. Not forgetting that we don't have rain in Egypt. We depend on the Nile River mainly for living, cultivation, and drinking and everything. And so the ancient Egyptians realized that this water come from Africa, and that's why they explored the Nile River. And in documented history, we don't have an evidence that the ancient Egyptians, they made it as far as the sources of the Nile River. But in the ancient Egyptian art, it is clear that they considered Habi, which is the god of the Nile, and the god of the Nile, Habi, is always introduced with a tray, introducing the Nile, the water of the Nile, with a tray with two jars on it, which is represented two tributaries of the Nile River. And that's, from my understanding, that is an evidence that the ancient Egyptians, they made it as far as Khartoum today. That's when they seen the two tributaries of the Nile, the White Nile and the Blue Nile, comes together there. So in trading, from prehistory time, there was a very strong trade between Egypt and Africa, and Aswan was the center of this trade, and that's where the name of the city came from, Aswan, which is the marketplace. In more specific, Elephantine Island, that was the marketplace of all of the African products which is introduced into Egypt. So one of the most important products which has been traded with Africa, with the south of Aswan, that was the gold. And that the entire land from Aswan south till the 4th or 5th cataract in the Sudanese land now is known as the Nubian, comes from Nuba, and that is Nub, which is named after the gold, the land of the gold. So another thing which is almost everything which the temples need, like incense and myrrh and many other products, that was also brought from East Africa. And we should not forget the very famous and the very well documented trade trip, which is sponsored by Hatshepsut, to the mysterious land of Punt, which is somewhere in East Africa today. The excitement or the interest of the ancient Egyptian kings with Africa led them destroy any obstacles on the way to Africa. So one of the big obstacles to sail along the Nile River to Africa, that was the First Cataract, which is a very rocky, lots of rocky islands, that's what make it very difficult, nearly impossible for boats to go through. So there was one of the very famous Egyptian kings, like in the Middle Kingdom, more than 3,000 years ago. He decided to cut to cut a canal through the cataract, which is very actually difficult work to do through the solid rock, in order to make it easy for the boats to travel to the south from the First Cataract, so they can keep sailing and make a highway to connect Egypt with Africa. Not only, so even to secure their trade routes with Africa, they built fortress, like in Buhin and other places, as far as the Third Cataract in Sudan, and that was from Senusert, the Middle Kingdom kings, as early as 3,600, 3,700 years ago. So he built a fortress, which is from that time, which is copied, the design was copied in medieval time Europe, because that was the best design for a fortress ever, which they used that design as an influence for that. So all of these stories, and there is many other stories, which gives you an idea of how much Africa was important for Egypt. And the interesting fact is that when the ancient Egyptians distracted from looking and focusing on Africa, and they looked to the other side, they looked into the Mediterranean Sea with the rising of the Greeks and Romans and Mesopotamians and all that's marking the decline of the ancient Egyptian civilization.
Right.
I'd like to focus on means of promoting Aswan now, as it is the focus of attention now in Africa, and it's a chance to market Aswan as a touristic destination.
Yes.
And especially, just to add to that, as a touristic destination for African African tourists as well.
Especially that we have a conference next at the end of this month, hosting many Arab and African youths.
So myself, I'm keeping inviting many of my African friends, especially Sudanese friends, to come to Aswan. And if I choose one city for Africans from Egypt for my friends in Africa, Aswan, that will be the best choice, because there they can see, and they can see the tide between Africa and Aswan. The interesting thing of choosing actually that as a cultural capital, that is not even from our modern time. You know, so one of the very important thing which is made by the ancient Egyptians 3,500 years ago is to introduce the Egyptian culture into Sudan, into Nubia, into the Third and the Fourth Cataract, in Jabal Barkal, in Karima, in order to get people there familiar with the ancient Egyptian culture, lifestyle, language, so they can build the relationship with that. And these are a very good lessons actually of what we should do today. In Africa, it has like 57 countries. There is almost 55 of them has been colonized, except only 2 which is not being colonized. And that gives you an idea of how much, when I said colonized, I was saying colonized in our modern time by European power. When I say, that's giving you an idea of how rich Africa is. So Egypt is very competitive in Africa. Our products, you know, I've traveled to Rwanda and Uganda and Sudan, so our products sell very easy there. You know, in compared to European markets, it's very complicated to sell our products there. It's happening, but it's much easier actually to sell it in Africa. There is lots of raw material in Africa, which is, that's why the colony actually was there and caused problems, by the way. But we can help them and help ourselves by turning these raw materials into products in their lands, in our lands. And there is a very successful Egyptian businessman, which is their names, their reputation sounds Greekly, in Uganda and Rwanda and Sudan, which is they are giving like a good examples of that.
I'm going to use your expertise in Egyptology and history and ask you, are there still monuments in Aswan today that show the connection between Aswan, Egypt, and Africa?
Definitely, you know, so not only in Aswan, all over Egypt, all over Egypt. So in starting the Nubian Museum. So the Nubian Museum is unique of its type. It's the only museum which is dedicated, classify and introduce the entire Nubian history, from the prehistory through the historical period into modern history. There is also the Philae Temple, which is beautiful temple on an island south of Aswan, and this temple is the last temple where the ancient Egyptian religion being practiced for the goddess Isis. And from there, from this temple, so this religion actually spread to the south of Philae as well. So we have the unfinished obelisk, which is one of the biggest miracles of engineering in ancient Egypt and achievements, to cut a huge obelisk 42 meters long from a very solid quarry, granite quarry, which is not being completed, but when you can go there, you can see that how the big challenge of which is created by the ancient Egyptian engineering in that. So we have the nobles' tombs in Aswan, which is really visited, and on top of that, which is, I almost forget that, the most important archaeological site in Egypt is Elephantine Island, which is, that is the beginning, or that is the oldest part of Aswan, and in this island, the southern part, have layers of history on top of each other, from prehistory until Christian and Islamic history and modern history, in layers. In one place, you can tell the whole history of Egypt. So the interesting thing that because of the colony did not want Egypt and Sudan, or Egypt and Egypt, will to be connected with Africa. So when they designed the borders and decided the borders, they make sure that these borders will create conflicts, not only between Egypt and Sudan, between many other African countries as well. So when they designed the train in Egypt and Sudan, so in purpose, the gauge, which is the width of the train line, so is different, is more narrow in Sudan than in Egypt, to make sure that there will be no train will be connected the two countries together. So they realized that how important that this connection is, how important this connection is.
Create division.
Exactly, and that's why they divide, so that we cannot grow as unity together. So 2 days ago, I had a meeting with a Canadian from African background. We spent 2 hours talking, actually, in one of the hotels here in Cairo, about, he decided to, that was his first trip to Africa. He's in his mid-50s, and he think and there is great potentials in Africa, and his dream is Africa to be united back, because that will bring the good for everybody in Africa.
Definitely.
So, sir, how can we open new markets in Africa for Egypt's tourism?
Shireen, for that, we need to introduce Egypt, the Egyptian history and the Egyptian civilization the right way. We need to introduce the Egyptian civilization as an African civilization. That's the first thing we should do. And that is the reality, that is because the problem, the reason why the ancient Egyptian civilization has been stripped out from its African roots, because again a colony, and that was happens by Western scholars who want to promote. In that time they were promoting for the slave trade. And they promoted for the slaves based on that the African slaves, they are not fully developed human being, that's how they will give the excuse for Europeans to use them as slaves, like farm animals, I mean. So in that time, when they discovered the pyramid of Egypt, if it was introduced as an African civilization, so that will blow up their slave trade, because that means that there was much more civilized people in Africa thousands of years ago, much more than the Europeans, and that's completely the opposite of what they are promoting for. And that's why in purpose that it was the Egyptian civilization has been stripped from its African roots. So that should be our approach. We should make the Africans proud of Egypt as represent African civilization and African history. That is our best approach. I think that this way we can attract their attention. Second, to make it easy for them. So to make it easy for them, we have 2 ways. So the border crossing between Sudan and Egypt, that needs to make it more easier for crossing. It's still things that's happening now, after waiting for a very long time, but need to be improved in a way that to make this trip, which is quick. People can stay there for like 4 or 5 hours. The second, declaring Aswan as a real international airport, which is not happening. It's designed as an international airport, but it's not used as an international airport. It's used only for domestics. And when Aswan airport receive flights from Khartoum, from Entebbe, from other capitals of Africa. That will help. So those two things need to be fixed.
Right. And how about the other way around, promoting Africa for Egyptians? So there's this cultural exchange.
That will be another interesting subject. Had a beautiful trip actually in different African countries, Uganda and Rwanda, Sudan, and I'm still building actually some itineraries for my exploration in the next few years. There is a great potentials in Africa for tourism. I remember that in my tour in Uganda, I've seen almost all of the animals, and which is I'm familiar with there. Not only, I've seen a very similar culture with the Egyptian as well, very warm culture, and that will help when people travel, and that will help in promoting Egypt in a good way as well.
Finally, I'd like to thank Mr. Samir Abbass, Egyptologist. Thank you, sir, for being with us.
Yeah, glad to be with you.